Hi there, Benji. Just to set the scene, could you provide a belt and braces overview of Galley Solutions?
Sure. So we're ultimately working to improve the lives of people working in the food industry, and we do that by empowering operators with technology. So we have a web-based technology platform that handles everything that happens in a kitchen. So the places where the food is being made into recipes or dishes that consumers are buying, we come alongside those operators and help them do their job more efficiently and more streamlined.
And how did you get to where you are today? Can you run through the corporate journey and also your personal journey as well?
Yeah, happily. So I went to school thinking I was going to be a psychologist. I wanted to help people. I sort of had this upbringing that led me in that direction of wanting to be a psychologist. I knew nothing of engineering or computer science, and ended up discovering both of those things while in school at college in Boston, and fortunately was able to make a quick change and transition to an engineering computer science degree, and just was in love with programming. And this was sort of right before the social network and all the sort of hype around coders. And so I purely just loved it and got into it, got my degree in computer science, and then joined a startup in Silicon Valley called Box. They went public a few years ago, maybe more than a few years ago now, and got a really good experience of what a later stage startup was like. Got to see really the ethos of Box that was differentiating it. Of enterprise software should not feel like enterprise software. Box was definitely on that leading edge to say, let's bring consumer-like software into the enterprise to give beautiful interfaces and really user-centric product design. And that really stuck with me in my journey. And after Box, I ended up joining a food startup in San Francisco called Sprig. And that's really where the journey for Galley began. Sprig was founded in 2013. And the fundamental product for Sprig was that people could order a different selection of 5 items every day where it was offered on a mobile app. So Sprig was a virtual kitchen, essentially a full stack virtual kitchen. So that meant that we made a mobile app for consumers to order food. We made the food, and then we also delivered the food with our own logistics platform. So it's essentially what Uber Eats and Postmates and DoorDash are today, but they didn't exist then. So Sprig had to build that customer interaction and the delivery platform, as well as make the food. And so it was that full experience of delivery food that is now so prevalent and such a strong market fit with what consumers want. And because we had to be that full stack, I got to see from the inside what that technology adoption and technology coming into that food industry does to an analog kitchen. Essentially, I was gluten-free at the time, and I was using the customer app, and the dishes were frequently mislabeled as gluten-free or not gluten-free. Things that should not have been labeled as gluten-free were marked as gluten-free, which is really bad. And things that were gluten-free were not marked. And I said, well, why is this happening? This is derivative data. This is a dish being gluten-free is a side effect of the ingredients in that dish. And we make the dish, so we should know what the ingredients are, and therefore we should be able to automate the gluten-free tag. And that's when I really discovered that there wasn't technology in the kitchen. It was largely spreadsheets, pencil and paper. And even though we were this Silicon Valley tech company, we weren't able to leverage that full stack integration that we had, that vertical integration that is usually so beneficial to a business, because the kitchen is essentially in the Stone Ages still. And so I started building a solution there. I started with a recipe management tool. And that made the lives of the R&D chefs a lot better. And it also solved my problem, where I could then ask an API, hey, what are the allergens for this dish? And then I saw that the sous chefs were coming in at 4 a.m. And I said, why? And they said, because we have to plan out the day every single day. And I said, well, isn't that just a derivative of the recipes and the plan and the menu? And so this system continued to evolve to take on more and more of the kitchen operations at Sprig, until ultimately it was running every single aspect of our food operation system. And that was essentially V1 of Galley. We literally called it Galley within Sprig. And I was the sole engineer working on that, building that out, and working with all the different people in the culinary organization, purchasers, inventory managers, sous chefs, R&D chefs, to build this solution. And when I had built that full solution, all sorts of folks from the industry who came to work for Sprig used the tool and said, wow, this would have been hugely valuable at my XYZ last job, whether that was hotel food, airline food, Michelin star chef. They all saw a use case for this solution that I had built. And so in 2017, Sprig unfortunately shut down. It was sort of a classic startup story of first mover, maverick, too high of a cost to actually build the infrastructure. And that left me with a unique opportunity to take this system that I had built. It all got thrown away in the trash with Sprig, so the code was thrown in the trash, but these ideas, this concept, this essentially business plan was in my head and was available to me to recreate. And that's when I partnered with my co-founder, Ian, who has a hospitality background, agriculture, education, and we've teamed up to build Galley as it is today. Which is essentially that same platform, that same concept of starting with the recipe. The recipes are the atomic unit of the food industry. If you model the recipe, you can start to automate pretty much many aspects of food operation and eventually of that modern food supply chain. And that's the product that we've gone to market with today.
Yeah. And I think you've obviously hinted on what problems you're trying to solve. It's essentially kitchens are largely analog, and you're effectively, or the back office side of the kitchen is analog, and you're effectively trying to automate it to generate savings and time savings, cost savings for the kitchen. Would it be possible to run through the life of a recipe in an analog kitchen from chef's idea to the plate?
Sure. Yeah, that's a fun exercise. So in a world without Galley or in an analog kitchen, you'll typically have, depending on the type of organization or size of the organization, either the recipes are being developed by the executive chef, or there's a dedicated team of recipe development chefs who are responsible for coming up with new recipes and finding gaps in the menu offering and filling those gaps with new recipes. But some chef is creating a new recipe, thinking of a new recipe. And if you're lucky, they're writing it down. Maybe they're writing it down in a spreadsheet is usually the most sophisticated way. Sometimes they're using a really old tool. There are tools that store recipes that were built in the 90s and look like they were built in the 90s. So it's a terrible interface, really difficult to do. And so most chefs don't use those sorts of tools. They just write them down in their own spreadsheet that they built. And as an R&D chef, you think about a recipe and you make the recipe maybe for 12 portions, because you're coming up with, you're not going to make a huge batch. So one of the first things you have to do to productionalize that R&D recipe, once you finalize, this is what I want to do, now you have to scale it up and you have to, increase the quantities. And maybe you originally wrote the recipe in ounces, but now you need to start talking about cases or bottles or packs. And so those unit conversions are cumbersome and tricky. Then you have to train your other chefs who are actually going to run this on a regular basis. So there's a training component. There's a communication of that recipe. And in an analog kitchen, you might just go and show a couple people. And now those people, you've transferred that knowledge into their heads. But if any of those people leave, you don't have to redo all of that work. And so if it's not written down in a consumable way, that training, that cost of turnover is really high. And then you have the sort of risk of the recipe starting to morph. Maybe the first month that you run it, it's exactly how it was when you R&D'd it. But over time, you sort of have this telephone game and the recipe starts to become something that it wasn't intended to be. And maybe that impacts quality, honestly, positive or negative. It means that there's still a very high cognitive cost to executing that recipe because there's no single source of truth. There's no guaranteed place that is the current accurate recipe that a new chef can come in, read that recipe and execute it completely autonomously. So those are, just from the chef's perspective, talking about the recipe. And then we think about what are all of the things that depend on the recipe? Well, there's sales forecasting. There's purchasing. How many pounds of chicken should I buy today? Well, that means that you need to understand what are the recipes we're offering. And if those aren't written down somewhere very clear, the purchasing manager or the executive chef or whoever's responsible for placing orders needs to track all that information down. So there's loss and error opportunity there. Then they have to scale up and they have to do those unit conversions. So from ounces to cases. And this vendor product is sold by a 10-pound case, and that vendor product is sold by a 13-pound case. So all of that math has to be taken into account. And so on, you have these compounding opportunities for error. And that leads to 20, 30% food waste in kitchens, just because these are all human-driven processes that are in themselves 5% error, 3% error, 10% error. And those things multiply to end up being a huge portion of the profit margin that's available to food businesses.
And so just to finish off the link, so to speak, Galley with its solution provides a full cycle solution. And
exactly.
Encompassing all the areas that you've just mentioned.
Yep. So beautiful interface to write your recipes. You can then plan your menus, and then we will generate for you a shopping list. So chefs no longer have to do any math. We will generate for you a prep list and a list of recipes that are appropriately scaled to whatever you planned. We will generate for you an inventory list to say, these are the most important things for you to take inventory on, so that you're not going through your entire kitchen and counting everything every single week, because you may be using that in the upcoming weeks.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I presume these are age-old problems for kitchens that you're looking to solve. So the question is why now? Why is a good time now to jump on board?
Yeah, so I think that the first thing, so to your point, I always love to say cavemen made food the same way that we make food today. It's the same fundamental process. They have this idea of a recipe. They have things that they put into that recipe. They have to go and hunt the mammoth and get the mushrooms and get whatever herbs. That's procurement. Then they have to bring those things in, and maybe they have dried mushrooms in their cave. That's inventory. And then they produce that, and they actually make the food, they cook it over the fire, and they feed their tribe. That fundamental process has always existed. So it's a good point of why now. Why now? I think for me, it was just my luck of getting in at this very early startup that was Sprig, that was this leading edge, this maverick company that was the beginning of this wave of digitization and innovation in the food industry. So that was just the dumb luck part of my entrepreneurial story. And then I think COVID has specifically accelerated this technology adoption curve that honestly before COVID had already started. Obviously, Uber Eats and Postmates existed before COVID, and they were just accelerated by, I would probably say 2 to 3 years in terms of consumer adoption of the technology and the commercial adoption of the technology. And so food businesses are now very open to adopting technology in the kitchen because it's a necessary tool for them to adopt the consumer-facing technology. And then I would say the last component is the labor shortage that we're experiencing globally across all industries, but very specifically in the food industry. This labor shortage means that there's higher turnover, there's fewer people available to do the jobs. So you need to level up the skill and the throughput of your labor force. And you need to support that labor force with a technology that can help them do their jobs better, that can help retain people because it's a less stressful job, that can increase your margins so that you might be able to pay people more so you can retain people so you don't have this cost of turnover. And maybe if you're paying people more, they're not stealing or they're not doing the things that are shady that are happening in the industry that are a side effect of this negative vortex that we have that's in the industry, where there's minimum wage labor because there's a lot of manual work, which means that they're not paid well, which means that they're not aligned with the business owner, which means that the profits are lower because they're not making good decisions, which means the wages are lower. And it's just this downward spiral of negative relationships. And we're working to reverse that into a positive flywheel to improve the lives of the employees, to improve the health of the business, and ultimately provide a better product for the consumers.
Sure. And is there, who's the competition? Are there any other solutions out there looking to achieve the same results as Galley?
Yeah, so there are definitely some other tools that have started to fill some of these gaps. There are tools that are specific around helping with the accounting. So there are some of those solutions that come in and say, okay, well, we're going to start with your P&L. of the food business, very much back office. You had mentioned towards the beginning of this back office. I like to make a distinction of back office and back of house, whereas back office to me is very much billing and all of the sort of administrative stuff that you can imagine, this desk filled with papers and there's a computer on it and there's this sort of owner operator who is the main user of a tool. We like to think of ourselves as more back of house, which is in the kitchen, the people actually making the food, influencing the P&L, making the buying decisions using this product. So there are a lot of back like a recipe management tool and a purchasing support tool, but they're very disjoint. They're very sort of single use. And I haven't really seen a competitor that takes this recipe first approach. That's our big differentiator, that we just start with the recipe, we focus on the recipe, and that leads to automation. It leads to better data downstream.
Sure. You mentioned individual solutions for particular segments of the back of house area of the kitchen. Is there an issue with these various solutions not being able to talk to each other or communicate with each other? And is that something that Galley can solve?
That's a great question. So yes, there absolutely is an issue that all of these point solutions are siloed. From day one as an engineer, and in being able to rebuild this, I built the platform to be API first. So our fundamental development principle is that we don't have any feature available only in the web app. Anything that you can do in Galley, you can do with our API, which means that our customers, who are typically large, enterprise level food businesses who probably have built their own technology or have some of these siloed point solutions that are very specific, and they want to send that data into Galley or get some of that Galley data out, they can use our API to accomplish that. And that's one of our other big differentiators, that we are API first. We are integratable with essentially any system that is equally integratable. So usually the limiting factor is on the other system, whether we can get data in and out of that system. But from our perspective, you can read any data out of Galley and you can write any data into Galley using our API. And that was a very intentional choice.
Right. And you mentioned that that's a limiting factor for other solutions. What obstacles stand in your way in the way of Galley?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think that because we are new, our feature, coverage is not as rich as some of the maybe other solutions that take a different lens and a different approach. And so at this point, we're just working as quickly as we can to fill out our feature coverage and create as many useful features for our users as possible. So we're in sort of hardcore scale mode now, building out our R&D team, and then also building out our customer support team and our sales team to get this solution to market. So I would say our biggest obstacle right now is that scaling challenge that many companies that just raised the Series A are struggling with as well.
Yeah, and how will you actually go about with the scaling up?
Yeah, so we've actually been able to scale our delivery team. We call it, that's our product and engineering team, really well because we have a very unique engineering model called mob programming. I won't get into too much details here, but it's a highly autonomous, fully empowered model where we have groups of 3 engineers working on a single problem. And so they sort of pair program the 3 of them. They're fully autonomous in their design and decision making. And that allows us to create these very self-sufficient autonomous groups of engineers that can onboard very quickly. And so we've been able to double the engineering team in the last 2 months, I believe. And we plan to double again by the end of the year. So we've been able to scale really quickly thanks to our mob programming, and we're fully remote. So we hire global talent and are able to capitalize on that labor market that can best align with our needs.
Great. And can you provide a run through a number of key numbers regarding the markets, regarding Galley? You mentioned, for example, the level of cost savings that you can look to target. Is there food waste targets as well that apply?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I would say, the first important number to us, as I've mentioned, our main focus right now is improving the lives of the folks working in kitchens. And so what we do is we actually send a stress survey to our users every month in the app. So while they're in Galley, they'll get a little notification to say, hey, how's your stress this month? And we've been able to see, I think it's like a 35 to 45% decrease in stress with users that have onboarded with Galley and reported their stress at the beginning of their journey and then continue on using Galley and through their job. So to us, that's sort of the most important metric, because we have this mindset that if you're less stressed at work, you're happier, you're able to make better decisions, and that's ultimately going to have an impact on businesses. Now, that sort of impact that we've seen is around food waste. We partnered with Cal Recycle, which is a California grant that we received early on, to measure the impact on food waste of a business who onboards with Galley, and we saw a 48% reduction in food waste from using Galley. So that just shows that the users are able to make better decisions. They're able to offload some of that cognitive complexity onto essentially a superpowered calculator to help them make better decisions.
Great. Fast forward a few years down the road, what's Galley's exit strategy?
That's a great question. I think that there are quite a few options there. One challenge almost is that we are so broadly applicable. So we have customers in pretty much every segment of every size. So we would definitely be looking to be independent of any specific food service operator, because we want to continue to provide value to the entire industry. So I think that probably my first choice for exit would be profitability or an IPO and continue to run as a private business or as a self sort of owned business. And then, I think that there are other solutions out there that would make sense to partner with, whether it's us acquiring or them acquiring us, but to continue to bolster this tech stack of value to the entire ecosystem.
Excellent. And finally, what's your secret sauce, your magic ingredients?
Yeah, so I think that definitely being recipe first is definitely our secret sauce. As well as our open API approach and our just this high level idea of usability. So that means not only our user interface, which is completely custom designed, completely custom implemented, it looks like nothing else that's available. And it's really intended to be visually pleasing, because our users are not, are chefs. They're creative types. They're folks who are used to beauty and creativity. And so we want to come alongside them in that. And then also on the development side, that API first approach fits into that usability. It means that we're usable by other systems, we're usable by other technologies.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you for taking the time to speak to us today, Benji. It's been very interesting hearing the Galley story so far. And we very much look forward to keeping tabs on your progress going forward.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.